Okay, so Debbie, thanks a lot for talking to me and the people at Waterloo. I know this is going to be valuable for them. I wanted to start just by asking you about your role with Interact, Chief Innovation and New Ventures Officer. Very exciting title and role, I expect too. Can you tell people about what you do, how your career led you there, and your experience in managing transition in financial services?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having me on. I would say so. So let me just start with the role. This is a team we formed probably about 3 years ago now, so it's relatively new. And the team and the group were formed to more systematically, I guess, think about the future. So we'd always been thinking about the future. It just seems that more recently, and certainly kind of accelerated through the last couple of years with the pandemic, we're all becoming more and more digitized. You know, your students, that's their reality of their life, right? So our digital norms mean that we need to think about, you know, more traditional industries, whether that be kind of financial services, which is, you know, certainly growing beyond you know, what you and I initially experienced, Peter, when we were much younger around financial services. So there was definitely a need for us at Interact to think about the future and to build a team that would look at that would be their full-time kind of goal, was to look at how we frankly can best future-proof the organization. So let me kind of back up a little bit and I'll talk about Interact, because one thing most Canadians actually don't realize is that Interact is uniquely Canadian. And with many countries over the past 20, 30 years have morphed more of their traditional domestic, let's say, payment infrastructures to the larger international brands like Visa and MasterCard. Canada, although we embrace, you know, some of the wonderful technologies that those companies bring, and I personally have worked for both those companies, so I have a lot of respect for them. Canada is a little bit different. We are classically quite well banked. We are very digitally savvy, as you and your students know. And we have been able to maintain our uniqueness around the world, partly through companies like Interact. So Interact is 100% focused on Canada. You may know that we kind of brought debit to Canada quite a long time ago now, almost 40 years ago. And Canada embraced debit as a replacement for something called a check, which many of your students might not even know what that is, hopefully. And Interact was formed by the financial institutions coming together and thinking about building a network. So we are predominantly kind of focused on helping Canadians. That's what we do. Our initial products were things that was like shared cash. So if any of you still use cash and you actually go to an ATM and you know you don't need to go to your bank's ATM, that shared network was one of the first iterations of Interact that grew into debit. And you will hopefully be using your debit solutions that your banks offer you, either through a piece of plastic that have a chip on it, or that you can use at the point of sale and online, or you might be doing it through a mobile device. And so I run innovation and new ventures, as you say, for Interact, and my team looks after typically things that we would say are 3+ years out, with a view of how best to future-proof our organization in the incredibly changing landscape that is all things digital. You know, it's a fantastic opportunity to work in the space because things change on a daily basis. It's also challenging for, you know, the ecosystem at large sometimes to be ensuring that we are ahead of the curve. So that was the kind of rationale as to why we created the group. And I kind of, the second part of your question was kind of, how did I get here? And so we were talking just before we started the recording. Many of the students might detect I have an accent. I was originally born in the UK, came over, emigrated with my parents as I was an older teenager, and as a summer job, one of my uncles who lived here was an executive at one of the banks and asked me if I wanted a summer job, and that summer job lasted 16 years as I was going to school and working at the bank. And I fortunately got to work on some of the early iterations of things that we all take for granted right now, like debit, as I said. So I worked on that many, many years ago, but also things like the point of sale infrastructure in Canada, ATMs, and I've had the opportunity to be able to do that here. Then my career took me to the UK, then it took me to the US, and then it came back here. So I kind of have my dream job right now. I've been in the space for a long time, and I get to kind of think about the 35 plus years of me doing this kind of thing, and the wonderful experiences I've had. And somebody much wiser than me once said, you get experience when you don't get a lot of what you're trying to get. So basically when things fail. So one of my things would be like, embrace the failure, because it will stand you in good stead as your career evolves. So as I say, I've got a dream job. My team and I get to look at some very interesting technology. One of the big things right now for us as we look at the changing landscape in the Canadian space is payments modernization. And I'll try not to geek out too much on this, but we get to look at how we can best enable Canadians to transact now and in the future. And a lot of that relies on some great technology, including crypto, that everybody's looking at the moment, and digital ID, which is another a big focus for my group.
Fascinating, and it does sound to me like a dream job. It's the sort of job that I would enjoy too. So what are the changes that are happening, that are impacting Interact in the financial services industry? And how much of that is driven by technology today?
I think, most of it's driven by technology, honestly, that like for all of us. And this applies to every industry. I'd say my industry that, is really kind of financial services and security, probably is the best way to describe it, is it really all about digital enablement. So if you think about, our experiences and what that means are quite different to what your students' experiences are, right? So your students are kind of digital natives. Everything they do is digital, whether that be from, kind of connecting with your friends in your community to transacting to, ordering your food, getting on transit, whatever that might be. So those changes, and they'll continue to accelerate. And I'm sure your students are all familiar with things like Moore's Law, which, just gets faster and faster and hopefully more economical, which means it gets to be more accessible, will continue. And I would say our experience over the challenges of the pandemic over the past couple of years have proven out that we can all continue to work remotely. We can continue to learn remotely, although that's probably not our preferred state. But the technology allows us to do that. So in my world, things that are really helping to spur on new innovation are pretty much the same as everybody else, as well as the power of computing power continues to evolve. The cost of that computing power continues to be reduced. It spurs on, fantastic innovation from things like distributed ledger and crypto to, all kinds of automation and data management. And data is probably, the topic of data is probably the major point of what is spurring on all of these changes in the way we interact, because now we have, computing power at our fingertips in our mobile devices that allow us to authenticate who we are very, very well, very securely, using, you know, amazing things like biometrics and face recognition and lots of other things, to really be able to just go about our daily lives in a you know, a kind of more relevant, more convenient manner because of the technology. And COVID-19 really brought that home to everybody, to the point now where, you know, the notion of having to go and line up for something is probably more of an inconvenience than anything, right? So we really do see a lot of changes. So you know, I can kind of double down on that from my industry if you'd like. I can talk a little bit about what that means. Yeah.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, so in Canada, let me just talk about the financial services industry, and that the financial services industry is, you know, traditional banking. That's not, you know, it's quite digital now. So the banking industry, the payments industry, and pretty much financial services, you know, is actually an industry that touches every other industry, because everything we have to transact, right? So whether that be through the technology and security around authentication, whether that be through some of the recent mechanisms to deliver that on a phone. You know, many of your students will use Apple Pay, Google Pay, and will be using crypto, likely, right? So many of that kind of technology we look at, and ID, digital ID is a big area for us. Digital authentication, and you know, a lot of people kind of get a little bit spooked on the notion of ID, but we authenticate ourselves. And so if you think about it more around digital access and enablement is probably a better way to think about what does that mean to all of us. And I mentioned data. So the notion of you know, machine learning and AI and all of the amazing stuff that goes on in that sector. These are things that you know, my industry look at, and we do that with the technology providers, some of the biggest companies around the world. And in KW, there's a lot of them there, right? So a lot of amazing presence there. And we've got our own Canadian success stories for many of them as well. So we look at that, and we look at how do we see that evolving, both from a, you know, a banking perspective. How does the bank engage with you? How do they ensure they're providing relevant services to you? What devices, what mechanisms for engaging with you? How do they deliver new capabilities to you? How do they work with the innovators in the market? You know, whether that be startups that are working with companies like Communitech and KW, or with the university. You know, we work with the ecosystem quite broadly, and we actively engage with the government and the policymakers around where we think some of those trends are going to take us, whether that be, you know, some of the ones I mentioned, crypto, NFTs. There's quite a big movement going on in Canada at the moment with the ecosystem led by the government, the regulators, and the large players in the ecosystem to modernize our payments infrastructure. So we spend a lot of time on that with the government at the federal and the provincial levels, and we spend a lot of time with Bank of Canada and Department of Finance to make sure that whatever those services are, that, you know, we have the appropriate infrastructure and capabilities to allow Canadians to, you know, to use the best and most relevant capabilities in the market at the time to really just go about your daily business.
Very interesting. So in what you've described there, what I'm hearing is that there are a lot of stakeholders you've got to consider.
Yes.
There are a lot of suppliers and other organizations
Yes.
that will provide you with information and advice on what you should do. So your strategy development process is presumably quite a lot lengthy, perhaps, but certainly one that has a lot of participants. Could you maybe say a little bit about that, and particularly any lessons from that that would be useful for other people?
Yeah, actually, strategy is it's a big part of my group's focus too. I didn't mention that earlier, but you can imagine that when you're thinking about the future, you also have to have that kind of appropriate framework in place to explore and develop a strategy, but a strategy that is actually going to provide value. So strategy is fantastic, but it needs to be implemented, obviously, right? So you have to have that framework to be able to get the best out of some of the thinking and the exploration. So we have quite a framework for strategy. And I would say we revamped that probably over the last few years. And we started to embrace the notion of strategic foresight. So we've spent a fair amount of time, not just internally at Interact, but we actually have taken our board on that journey as well. For many of your students, I'm sure they already know, what strategic foresight involved is really looking at things like weak signals in the market, and also doing your research, of course, but looking at things that are happening on the fringe, and being able to pull those weak signals together and look at what's happening in technology, where's society going, bring in some kind of insights from societal norms and economics, to really think about not just the journey we're on, but what the hypothetical, so the potentials for what might happen. So we embrace this notion of monitoring weak signals, mapping out various hypotheses, and then doing what's been called backcasting to look at the art of the possible, what happens if scenario. We do that in a number of different sectors. So obviously we look at our own market, we look at financial services, but as I said earlier, just even the kind of process around thinking about payments, pretty much every transaction that we do involves a payment, involves a way of authenticating who you are and who you are connecting with. And then when you think about that in the world of IoT and where we're going, it's not just humans, right? So it's machines and devices and all of those things. So we bring those various different elements together. We try to embrace a framework of strategic foresight, and we do some hypotheses around the optimistic and the not so optimistic scenarios, and then we map out where we think we should be going against what our strategic goals and priorities are. So we map out where we are today, where we see the opportunities, where we see the challenges, and then align what our corporate priorities are to our kind of roadmap for the future. And we've actually put a fair amount of rigor into that over the past few years, which has been actually a fantastic experience. And we also, in support of that, my group, as you would imagine, we get to explore some of that art of the possible. And we actually have a group within my team called the Innovation Lab, that we actually then do some prototyping. So we do some safe play. And we do that with, as you said, the broader ecosystem. So we have relationships with a number of accelerators and startup organizations, including Communitech in KW. So we have a team that works very closely with the folks at Communitech or at Mars Discovery District in Toronto to be able to think through the art of the possible, but it gives us that kind of hands-on experimentation capability too. And we do that actually with students as well. So we do that very actively with, students, whether they're in a co-op structure or just interns. And that gives us a bit of a framework to map out, what our priorities are. How do we kind of align that with where society is going, where we see kind of societal interactions, and what it could be the art of the possible for Interact to continue to be a leader and service Canadians.
Absolutely, and that's a very helpful description of what you do. The people who will be watching this are going to be learning about how their organizations should do these things, and your description there is very practical and I think very helpful for them to be able to understand that. So with all that, what does this mean for what Interact will be doing in the future? What are the main changes that you're working on at the moment? What will be different about Interact in a few years?
Sure, thanks. So we are known for payments, right? So, many of you hopefully will use Interact on a daily basis, whether that be to, grab a coffee or use e-transfer, which is, a really popular solution that's out there. So e-transfer has been in market since 2003. So, not many people realize what an incredible Canadian success story this is. Since 2003, we've been able to move money directly from your bank account to somebody else in Canada. And because Canadians are very well banked statistically, that pretty much means, the entire kind of teen and adult population. So if you've got a bank account, you can use e-transfer and you can move money, and you can do that quite easily on a mobile device, etc. But we've been exploring, and we've brought some new capabilities to market to bring what Canadian consumers know and love with e-transfer to Canadian businesses. And as you guys know, the backbone of the Canadian economy is small to medium businesses. So you will see more and more of that. You'll see enhancements to some of the mobile and e-commerce solutions that we've had out in market. We were the first, another Canadian success story. Canada with Interact was the first domestic debit network around the world that launched Apple Pay. So we work with big companies, as I said earlier, to be able to bring some of those solutions. You will see more and more kind of digital capabilities to be able to do your day-to-day activities, whether that's get on transit or interact with the government. So one of the big kind of focus areas for, as I mentioned earlier, was kind of digital access and enablement through our digital ID capabilities. This year, you will see much more of that through our branding exercise. So the past couple of years, we've done a couple of acquisitions, both to Canadian companies. Sounds like I'm really doing the Canadian show here, but both with Canadian companies, which is incredible success story. We did an acquisition in 2019 of a company out of Ottawa called Two Keys, that is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Interact. And then in last year, we concluded a deal with another Canadian tech company called SecureKey to leverage their technology. So you'll see more Interact branding around being able to access lots of other digital services at the federal, provincial, municipal level, and in the private sector. So you will see a lot of that. We are working very actively with the broader ecosystem and the government to modernize Canadian, the kind of more infrastructure. So, for the payment geeks will appreciate some of the infrastructure challenges. So we are bringing some incredible modernized capabilities around the Canadian payments landscape that will include open banking. So you might have heard that from other markets, that basically allows a user to authorize a third party to access their bank account. So you'll see some cool stuff in that arena. That's probably next year. You'll see 2023. You'll see some of that, and I think as data continues to be a major topic, you'll see changes driven from the government around privacy and data portability that we are actively involved in as well, including things like, being able to access the same tool to get into a building as well as pay for something, as well as get your driver's license online. So all of those things under the guise of how can we bring some of these assets together, deliver to Canadians what they know from us, which is, secure capabilities, secure payments, and expand it to some new, pretty cool experiences.
It sounds like a digital ID, or you're branching out from the payments to more of a digital ID type.
Yeah, you're right. Those two assets that I mentioned really allowed us to think about how we continue to deliver to Canadians across the country, that secure transaction, which means, especially now that, many industries are interconnected, whether that be health, and we've seen that, the need for digitization in the healthcare industry over the past couple of years, for sure. So health, transportation, education, manufacturing, retail. So some of the great tools that we're known for, obviously you'll see that permeate across the payments landscape and to others, particularly with a digital ID capability in market this year.
Very interesting. And so this presumably implies changes for the organization, for Interac as an organization. How disruptive are those? Does this mean big changes that you need to make?
Like every organization's being disrupted, right? That's the reality of our life. So yeah, for us, certainly myself and my team, these are things that we embrace. So we're on I kind of characterize it as a continuous transformation journey. This isn't a one and done. It's as technology evolves and as our living environment changes, we have to be able to adapt to that. And that I believe is going to be the cornerstone of any successful organization, especially an organization like ours who are in the business of trust, right? So you have to be able to adapt. So yeah, we are, we're on that continuous journey to ensure that our products and our service offerings are relevant to what Canadians need to go about their daily lives. So that also means that, we have to, of course, we talked a fair amount about technology. We have to be able to embrace technology. It also means we have to be able to staff up with the skill sets required, not just for today, but the skill sets for tomorrow. And that we have a continued role in the evolution of our economy. And that means that we have to be inclusive and we have to be relevant. And so we have to be in tune with what's going on in the marketplace, whether that be through, environmental challenges and climate change, to changing policies at the government level, to just, I mentioned, the notion of being inclusive, just to being relevant to the market, certainly around a focus of diversity and inclusion. So that continuous journey for us is pretty much part of our kind of DNA. It's something we work very hard on to ensure that it is part of our culture at Interac, and to ensure that we are connected with the broader ecosystem. So we are, we're engaged with many of the kind of think tanks across Canada. We're engaged with policymakers, with the standards bodies. So, you know, we're active with the things like the CIO Strategy Council, which is a public-private partnership with an entity called DIAC, which is the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada, with the Standards Council of Canada, to ensure that whatever we're looking at continues to allow Canadians to have trust in the services that we bring to market.
Wonderful. And so you've described a number of the internal challenges, I guess, or the things that are impacting you internally. Earlier, you described that you worked with a number of partners, and that's been a theme in a number of your responses.
Right.
How are you managing your relationship with them as you're making these changes? How do you ensure that that operates effectively?
It's a great question. I mean, you know, partnership is kind of a pillar of how we go about doing our work. I'd say that's actually probably a theme right across Canada, right, for our industry, and we are very, very much focused on a public-private partnership. I mentioned earlier, Interact's unique. Our shareholders are the financial institutions in Canada. They are regulated. We are regulated. So we have to have, you know, very strong relationships with the various governing bodies, the regulators, the policymakers. So I would say, if you think about the, you know, your Venn diagram of partnerships, there's definitely the government sector. There's definitely, and as I said earlier, that's at the federal and given the Constitution, obviously that's at federal, provincial, but also municipal levels. And then we've got the ecosystem partnerships, and I would characterize that as kind of innovation and players who are really trying to, you know, move the needle in Canada around our digital enablement. That includes the universities and University of Waterloo. It includes, you know, the kind of academic think tanks. It includes the accelerators and the incubators across the country. We have to have partnerships at the technical level. So we have partners in, you know, what I guess traditionally you'd think of as vendors, but given the dynamic of technology and the continuous evolution of technology, that is really more like a partnership, you know, whether that be at the big, you know, kind of fintech players, whether that be Apple, Google, Microsoft, you know, you guys know who I'm talking about. So we have partnerships there. We have partnerships at association levels, because we have to work on standards that don't just work for Canada, but allow Canadians to interact around the world. So that, you know, if you happen to be lucky enough to be on vacation or you're studying abroad, that you can still transact in the way that you would be able to transact in Canada with trust. And we have those kinds of partnerships. So it is a very big focus for us. And as we look to the future, that kind of, you know, that flywheel from a partnerships perspective actually gets broader, right? Gets bigger and bigger as those industries start to kind of blend into each other. So we have partnerships at the retail level. We have partnerships at the entertainment, sports, etc. So it is a very big focus for us at Interact.
Very interesting. And the other aspect I wanted to ask about are the cultural implications of your innovation and change, I guess. You know, we often talk about the need for organizations to change culturally, to be more open to change, and to be more oriented towards innovation. How does that impact what you do, I guess?
It's a big piece in it. You know, so we have this internal name that we call One Interact. Like many organizations, we have lots of different departments, right? So and to ensure that we have a kind of cohesive approach, we map out a vision. We figure out what our strategic priorities are. We have rolling priorities, usually kind of every 3 years, they kind of roll on. So we've got a North Star, if you like. We have the vision, we have our corporate priorities, so that everybody is part of that journey. Everybody knows within the company what we're doing. And we have lots of different cultural areas or focuses that make up our culture, rather. So I mentioned earlier diversity and inclusion. That's a big part of our One Interact culture. Being able to work as a team remotely, like that was a challenge for all of us at the start of COVID, right? So we quickly formed a team. The team was made up not just of our HR professionals, but also representatives across the organization, come together and figured out what could we do as a group to continue to deliver our, first and foremost, continue to deliver the service for Canadians, could continue to innovate and grow and bring new products to market, but what's that dynamic of working together? And so, you know, we instituted some interesting things that some have worked, some continue to evolve. We have quiet hours. We do try to continue to do some fun things together, because it's important to celebrate, right? Because we're all faced with the challenges, so it's important to acknowledge your success and to celebrate. So we have things like, we have yoga classes, we have painting classes, we have, and these were all conducted remotely throughout the pandemic, and we're almost at the start of getting back to the office, and even that is going to look differently. Like many companies, it's going to be most likely a hybrid approach. So we've been we've engaged the entire organization as to how we best do that, what's going to work for every individual, how do we support that as an organization. And we've been very conscious of, you know, the mental impact of COVID. Lots of people had to work remotely while they're still either looking after people in their family, whether it's elderly people in their family or, you know, young families still logging on every day. So we're very conscious of that, and we try to institute programs that are mindful of things like mental illness awareness, and what can we do to support that. You know, this is a journey, right, for any company. I would say we have the luxury of, we already had a fantastic culture before COVID. What we tried to do was continue to drive that employee engagement in a remote way, and that it seems to have worked. And now we're trying hard to work through, okay, what does the next flavor of probably a hybrid model, where, you know, some people will want to come back to the office full time, which is great. Some people won't want to come back to the office at all. And our stats, our surveys, and the research we've done with the team is going to suggest that we'll likely have a hybrid model. So we're working hard at the moment, actually, to redesign what our office space will look like. Because, as you said, you know, my team's focus is innovation and future-proofing the organization. So we have to collaborate on that, and see what tools work best for us in that journey. And so far, I think we're doing okay. To be honest, we were again this year we were recognized for some of our work as an organization with our teams, And we've been certified with a company called Diversio, which looks at diversity and inclusion. But, you know, I think, again, like technology, this is just an ongoing journey of, you know, how a corporation and its employees continue to be successful.
Yeah, it's very helpful to hear you talk about the different areas that you're working on at the moment. You're describing some things that have moved on and worked well, and you're discussing others that are still in progress.
Yeah.
And fairly clearly, many organizations are in the same boat of now working out what the future of work will be. So it's very good to talk to you at this point in your own change.
Yeah.
I've got two further questions. The first is, you've talked on women in leadership in financial technology. I'd be keen to hear your thoughts about that, because I'm sure there are many people who'll be watching that will find that valuable.
Sure. You know, it's a topic close to my heart, to be honest. Like many industries, there's a lot of women in our industry, but those numbers get smaller and smaller as you kind of, you know, look at the top of the organization. So my industry is kind of male dominated, like many industries. So this has been a I guess, a labor of love for me. And I get the luxury of being in a position where I can influence that at the moment, which is great. So I've been involved with many organizations in the payment space. There's a Women in Payments organization that we actively support, and that recognizes, you know, the journey of women in the payments and the financial services industry, that recognizes, you know, from the, you know, the kind of newbies just starting their career, you know, through to women who have got a wealth of knowledge because they've been in the space for many years, and how you can give back. So that I'm very focused on, and I think, you know, it's kind of important for people like ourselves, Peter, that when we get into this stage in our career and we're elder, that not only do you get to give back, but you get to help people on the journey of their career. And if you've been lucky enough to have, you know, that support, as I had when I was, you know, starting my career off quite young, that is hugely important and hugely influential. And I would say, if any of the students have got an opportunity to kind of, you know, find a mentor, do it. So I'm actively involved in that. I'm a founding member of a women's group, a women's club actually in Toronto, that was founded by a woman who was an investment banker. Her name is Mary Aitken, and she was just so fed up of going to places that was dominated by men. So she started her own club. Why not? And that's a fantastic facility for women, you know, to think about growth, not just from a professional perspective, but a physical perspective. So there's a lot of focus on health and wellness, and but also mental, you know, and kind of personal growth. So where I can, I'm involved as much as possible. I haven't done so much lately, but I used to facilitate an amazing group called Masterminds, where a group of women come together to think about, almost like having your own personal, you know, advisory board. And corporations do this, right? Every corporation has a board, every corporation has an advisory board. So why not do that on a personal level? Which has been very helpful for me, you know, in my career. And I try to champion diversity and inclusion as much as possible. I'm a firm believer that we all benefit from kind of, you know, diverse thought, you know, from different perspectives and having input. And that absolutely applies to life. It absolutely applies to your career, and it certainly applies to corporations. So I encourage that as much as possible. And because I get to work in innovation, that means I get the opportunity to try stuff out. right? And try things out, so we get the opportunity to embrace the art of the possible, embrace something new. And if it doesn't work, sometimes in life it doesn't work, sometimes in technology it doesn't work, that's fine. That experience is as valuable as anything that does work immediately. So I think just the notion of innovation in work is actually a fabulous kind of philosophy for life.
Wonderful, and very important too. Just one last question. You mentioned earlier that you had some advice for people who would be watching around their careers. You said, don't be afraid to fail or learn from your mistakes. So I thought I would finish by just expanding a bit more on the advice that you might have for people who are watching and starting their careers soon. So if you would like to share that advice.
Sure. I would say the first thing is, be curious. Now, your students are already curious because they're your students, right? So that comes naturally to many of you. So I would say that just continue that thread. Be bold. From the perspective of, don't be afraid to reach out to somebody who is in power. Don't be afraid to ask them a question. My guess would be more often than not, they'll have time for you. And if they don't, try again. And if that doesn't work, try somebody else. But I would say, like, give it a shot, because you never know. And certainly my experience has been, people will help out where they can. So don't be afraid to reach out. And career-wise, I would do that, use the tools at your disposal, which is social media, and to reach out and make those connections. And where you can, find a mentor. And don't worry if things don't work out. You're at the stage in your life where it will ultimately work out. And all of those things that could be labeled as a failure in the early days of your career are actually going to be insights you will use at some point to make you more successful. But I don't be afraid to reach out would be the one thing I'd probably say, and do it to, find out what area it is you're interested in and just reach out to someone who has been successful in that area, and make a connection.
Thank you for doing this, Debbie. That was great advice. Your advice on all of the questions we've discussed has been valuable. So I really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure. No problem. Thank you.